Chapter 1. The Empty Garden Chair. There were few things Miss Marple enjoyed more than a late morning in her garden, except, perhaps, overhearing something she wasn't supposed to. It was a Thursday in May, and the air in St. Mary Mead carried the sweet scent of lilac and something far more elusive: tension. From her position beneath the rose-covered trellis in her front garden, Miss Marple could just make out the rooftops of Wisteria Lane, one of the newer developments where the houses were all terribly modern, and the residents even more so, young couples with London money and odd notions about privacy. Not that privacy had ever truly existed in the village, especially not when one was as observant as Jane Marple. She adjusted her sun hat, took a careful sip of her elderflower cordial, and let her gaze drift casually toward the lane. And there it was again, the absence. Number 4, Wisteria Lane, the garden chair was empty. It was a small thing, trivial to most, but Miss Marple had noticed over the past week that the chair, usually occupied by Mrs. Adeline Blackthorne each morning without fail, had remained stubbornly vacant. Now, that in itself was not remarkable. People went on holidays. People fell ill. But what was remarkable was the silence that followed. No news, no departure, no friendly waving goodbye. Simply nothing. Gone. Miss Marple leaned back and folded her hands. Her mind, sharp as ever despite her years, clicked through its drawers of memory and deduction. Adeline Blackthorne was not the kind of woman to disappear without a flutter. She was wealthy, rumoured to be the widow of an oil baron, and had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 6 months earlier with trunks of expensive clothing, a live-in maid with a nervous stutter, and a deep disdain for company. Except, of course, for the mysterious visitors. Yes, Miss Marple had seen them. A man with a limp and a grey overcoat, a girl in sunglasses who never smiled, a pair of foreigners, possibly Austrians, who had visited twice in 1 week and never returned. And now the garden chair was empty. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her skirts. Something wasn't right. The local constable, a plump young man named P.C. Hargreaves, looked distinctly uncomfortable as Miss Marple laid out her concerns. "Missing, you say?" he repeated, scratching the back of his head. "Are you quite sure, Miss Marple? She might have just gone to London." "She did not go to London," Miss Marple said with crisp certainty. Adeline Blackthorne detested the city. She referred to it as a festering nest of sin and soot at least twice in my hearing. Well, maybe she changed her mind. She had a cat, Miss Marple added, which is now being fed by the maid, Ruth, who appears terribly on edge. The constable sighed. "Still, it's not a crime to be missing." "No, but it is unusual to leave your jewellery, handbag, and all personal effects behind, including a half-finished embroidery." He blinked. "How do you know about the embroidery?" "Dear boy," said Miss Marple, "you must learn to ask better questions." She made her way to Wisteria Lane herself the following morning. The lane was quiet, deceptively so, the sort of quiet that grew louder the longer one listened. Number 4 was a pristine white cottage with fashionable lilac shutters and a front garden arranged with surgical precision. Yet there was no soul in sight. Miss Marple rang the bell. After a pause, The door creaked open, and Ruth, the maid, stood blinking in the light like a mole, disturbed from its burrow. "Miss Marple," she stammered, I didn't expect—" "No, I imagine you didn't," Miss Marple said kindly.
That's why we make that. This is really clean, as if someone had dragged
away more than dust. Miss Marple let her eyes travel across the sitting room. A lamp knocked slightly askew. A single glass with the faintest lip print. A fire grate scrubbed too clean. "Where is your mistress, Ruth?" she asked softly. I don't know," the girl said, and to her credit, she tried to sound firm. "She's gone on a short trip." Without her handbag? Ruth's lips trembled. Miss Marple reached out gently. "You can tell me. I only want to help." Ruth took a shaky breath, looked around the room as if afraid it might speak, and whispered, "She told me not to say, but she was scared. Before she left, if she left, she told me not to answer the door unless I knew the person. She kept saying someone was coming, someone she thought was dead." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the night before she vanished, did you hear anything?" "A whisper," Ruth said, barely audible. "In the garden, just a whisper. But I don't know if it was real." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat down with a fresh pot of tea and her well-worn notebook. A whisper, a vanishing widow, a house too clean. She jotted down the names of the visitors she had seen over the past months, cross-checked her memories with gossip from the vicarage tea and Mrs. Bartlett's bridge group. All the while, her mind worked, in its curious labyrinthine way, threading together scraps of oddities and inconsistencies. Adeline Blackthorne had enemies, that much was certain. And she had secrets, the kind that could whisper from the garden and leave an empty chair behind. That evening, just as the sun dipped low over the hedgerows, Miss Marple received an envelope. It had been slipped under her, door-dot plain parchment, no stamp, no handwriting on the outside, inside a single slip of paper, typed, "Do not meddle. She got what she deserved." Miss Marple stared at the note for a long time. Then she smiled. "Dear me," she said aloud, placing the note on her mantle. "It appears I've been noticed." Chapter 2. Tea, Lies, and a Garden Gatist. Mary Mead had always been a village that treasured quiet, but quiet was not the same as peace. By Saturday morning, the air was full of whispers, not the ghostly kind Ruth had described, but the human ones. Curious, prodding, gossipy. People were beginning to notice the absence of Adeline Blackthorne. It started with the grocer's wife, who remarked that Mrs. Blackthorne had not been in to collect her usual order of figs and Turkish delight. Then came Mrs. Godfrey, who swore she'd seen a strange man with a case standing at the gate of number 4 at an ungodly hour on Wednesday night. Finally, there was Reverend Eastbrook's daughter, young Judith, who told her father she had seen someone digging in the Blackthorne garden by moonlight. By noon, the matter was being spoken of with solemn gravity over every fence and through every hedge. Miss Marple, for her part, kept quiet. She had work to do. "I've only just started at the Historical Society," Judith Eastbrook said eagerly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. And there was a project Mrs. Blackthorne was going to sponsor, a catalogue of old estate maps. But now, of course, she's simply vanished. Papa says it's probably a family emergency, or nerves." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. She didn't strike me as the nervous sort. Judith shook her head. "No, not nervous, but aware. You know, like she was watching things we couldn't see." "Did she ever mention her past?" "Not to me, but I heard she lived abroad, somewhere in North Africa." That was new. Miss Marple tucked it away in her mental drawer and took a prim bite of seed cake. "And the man with the case?" she asked, pretending nonchalance. Judith flushed. "I told Papa about him, but he said it was probably a delivery man. But he didn't look like one. He was tall, with a scar down one cheek, and he smoked these awful little black cigarettes." "What time did you see him?" 11:30 at night. Strange hour for deliveries," Miss Marple said softly. That afternoon she returned to number 4. Ruth answered the door again, pale as milk. "She isn't coming back, is she?" the girl whispered. Miss Marple took her gently by the hand. "Tell me what happened. Everything." Ruth hesitated. Then, in a low, rushed voice, she spoke. "It started 3 weeks ago. Letters. No return address. She burned them as soon as she read them, but I saw the look on her face after, like she'd seen a ghost." "Did you see any names?" "No, but I think it was someone from her past, someone she owed something to." "Did she tell you that?" "She said, 'I paid once, I won't pay again.'" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And then she started hearing things. Footsteps outside, at night, the whispering. I heard it once myself. It was like a breath through the hedge. Then she packed a case, but never left. She spent a full day just sitting in the garden. And then she disappeared." Ruth nodded on the verge of tears. "I woke up the next morning and she was gone. Her bedroom window was open. Her bed was untouched. And you didn't call the police. She made me promise I wouldn't. Said they couldn't help. Said they wouldn't understand. By Monday, the news had reached the Colonel. Colonel Arthur Melchett, retired proud and perpetually red in the face, paid Miss Marple a visit under the pretence of returning a borrowed gardening book. "You've heard, I presume?" he said, gruffly, once she had poured his tea. "I have." "Well, I'll say it plainly, Jane, it's odd. And when things are odd in this village, I generally find you've already started poking around." Miss Marple gave a modest smile. "Just a few gentle inquiries. For my own understanding, you know." Melchett nodded. "We looked into her a bit, back when she moved in. It's what one does. She came from Marrakesh, we were told, widow of an American businessman, although no one could quite confirm his name. And she kept herself very much to herself. That's often a sign of someone trying to start again," Miss Marple murmured. "Or someone trying to hide." He leaned closer. "Tell me, do you think she's dead?" Miss Marple hesitated only a moment. "I think," she said, "that someone wanted her to disappear. Whether she's dead or not depends on how badly they wanted it." The next development came by chance, or rather, by cat. Miss Marple had never particularly liked cats, but she respected their ability to find things humans could not, and it was Muffin, the marmalade stray that haunted Mrs. Bartlett's dustbins, who first scratched at the broken patch of hedge behind number 4. Miss Marple, observing from across the lane, took it as an invitation. When she stepped behind the hedge, she saw it. A small garden gate, rusted, overgrown, nearly invisible from the road. She opened it with effort. It led to a narrow path between properties, once used for gardeners and delivery boys, long forgotten. There, caught in the bramble, was a strip of fabric, silk, pale green. Miss Marple picked it up with gloved fingers. It shimmered faintly in the afternoon light. Adeline Blackthorne had owned a pale green robe. She'd worn it every morning in her garden. This was no coincidence. She followed the path, slow and steady. 20 paces, 30, a turn. And then footprints old but unmistakable. Heavy boots, one tread uneven, a limp. Miss Marple frowned. Judith Eastbrook had mentioned a man with a limp. The path curved again and opened behind a different house. Number 7, vacant. Had been for months. The back door was ajar. Miss Marple stood perfectly still, listening. And then she heard it, a sound too faint for anyone but her to notice. A whisper. She left quickly and quietly, her mind alight. A whisper. A garden gate. A man with a limp. A widow who vanished and a girl who saw someone digging by moonlight. There was a story here, and she was going to find it. That evening she wrote a letter. Not to the police, not yet, but to an old acquaintance at Scotland Yard, retired now, but sharp as ever. A man who owed her a favour from the days of the vicarage, a fare. She asked for a discreet inquiry into Adeline Blackthorne, specifically her time in Marrakesh, and any known associates, especially anyone with a scar on his face and a limp in his step. She sealed it, placed it by the postbox, and returned to her sitting room. The whisper still echoed faintly in her ears. But Miss Marple, now more certain than ever, did not flinch. She merely smiled and waited for the truth to bloom. Chapter 3. The Man with the Scarlet Glove. The letter from Scotland Yard arrived on Thursday morning, tucked discreetly between the advertisements and circulars in Miss Marple's post. She opened it in the privacy of her sunlit kitchen, spectacles perched on the end of her nose, and read every word twice before she folded it neatly and placed it under the sugar bowl. Adeline Blackthorne, née Adelaide Mertens, had lived in Marrakesh for over 12 years. Her husband, Charles Blackthorne, had been a trader in fine carpets and curios, a business which, according to the Yard's source, had ties to less savoury exports, antiquities of uncertain origin, rare poisons, and falsified travel documents. Charles had died in a suspicious boating accident in Tangier. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, something else entirely. Adeline had returned to England under a different name 6 months later. No obituary, no announcement. Quiet as a ghost. Miss Marple, sipping her tea thoughtfully, said aloud, "So you were running, my dear. But from what? Or from whom?" That same day, Miss Marple paid a visit to the one place in St. Mary Mead where secrets could always be coaxed out with the right kind of smile. The hairdressers, Mrs. Lavinia Peakes, who ran the salon above the greengrocer's, knew every scrap of personal drama in the village and had no shame in passing it along, so long as one pretended not to be listening too hard. Miss Marple arranged an appointment for a trim she didn't need, and after a brief chat about the weather and a firm opinion about the bishop's last sermon, she gently guided the conversation to Wisteria Lane. "Such a pretty woman, Mrs. Blackthorne," Lavinia said, running a comb through Miss Marple's fine white hair. "A bit sharp around the edges, if you ask me, but money smooths most roughness." "Did she ever talk during her visits?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, no," Lavinia scoffed. "Very private, not like the others. But she did have a visitor once, while she was here. Came storming in, all drama and accent, foreign, you know. Do tell. Tall man, dark suit, left a red glove on my counter. He was in such a state, never came back for it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A red glove? Scarlet, darling, and only one." Miss Marple left the salon 10 minutes later with a fresh set and the glove in her handbag. Back at home, she examined it under the lamplight. It was leather, finely made, faintly scented with tobacco, and something faintly metallic. The fingertips were worn, as if the owner used his hands a great deal, perhaps to play an instrument or to handle weapons. She pressed the material gently between her fingers, felt a slight stiffness in the lining, and reached in. A thin slip of paper had been sewn just behind the wrist seam. She teased it out carefully. It was a receipt, handwritten, Marrakesh M. Jalal, Rare Books and Eastern Curiosities, and beneath it a name, Rashid. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Marrakesh, smugglers, an Eastern man named Rashid, and a widow with secrets. The whisper wasn't just fear. It was memory coming back to collect. That evening, Miss Marple invited Reverend Eastbrook and his daughter Judith for tea. Under the guise of talking about the Historical Society's funding woes, she slipped into the real topic at hand. "Judith, dear," she said, "you've such a sharp eye. Have you seen anyone lingering about number 4 since Mrs. Blackthorne's disappearance?" Judith hesitated. "I didn't want to say anything. Papa thinks I read too many detective novels." The Reverend coughed but said nothing. Judith lowered her voice. "I saw someone again, 2 nights ago. Tall, broad-shouldered. He was standing at the back gate, the little one no one uses, just standing. Then he slipped away like a shadow. I only saw him because I dropped my compact near the window. Could you tell if he was watching the house?" "Oh, he wasn't watching the house," Judith said softly. "He was watching Ruth. She was in the kitchen. She never saw him." Miss Marple's mind turned swiftly. Ruth was the key. The maid had seen something, or knew something, and someone wanted her to stay quiet. She arrived at number 4 just after dusk. Ruth opened the door with red-rimmed eyes. "He's been here again, hasn't he?" Miss Marple said gently. Ruth broke. "He's watching me," she sobbed. "He leaves things at the door. A flower, a coin. The last one was a little brass charm. I found it on my pillow." Miss Marple calmed her with warm tea and gentle words. When Ruth could speak again, she told Miss Marple the rest. Back in Marrakesh, there was a man, Rashid. He worked with Mr. Blackthorne, but there was a falling out, something to do with a stolen relic. He claimed Adeline knew where it was hidden. When Mr. Blackthorne died, Rashid blamed her, and now he's followed her here. Yes, she got the first letter 3 weeks ago. He said he wanted what was owed, that he was coming to collect. Miss Marple's expression darkened. "Did she ever tell you what this relic was?" "She called it the Whispering Idol, said it was cursed, but I think she was just afraid." "Where is it now?" "I don't know," Ruth cried. "She said she'd destroyed it years ago." Miss Marple looked into the girl's eyes and believed her. That night, Miss Marple stood at her front window, long past midnight, watching number 4 through a pair of opera glasses. The street was still. No owls, no foxes, no wind. And then movement. A figure appeared behind the hedge. Tall, dark, limping. She watched him unlock the back gate. He moved slowly, carefully, glancing behind him once. Then he disappeared into the garden. Miss Marple set down the glasses and reached for her telephone. It was time to bring in help. The following morning, a plainclothes officer arrived from London. Detective Inspector Francis Hyde. Young, cool-eyed, and quietly curious. Miss Marple met him at the station herself. "Thank you for coming," she said, offering him a wrapped scone. "I believe we are on the edge of something very dangerous." Hyde took the scone. A man with a limp, a red glove, and a taste for curses. Sounds like the beginning of something out of the Arabian Nights. "Let's just hope it doesn't end in tragedy," Miss Marple murmured. As they walked together back toward Wisteria Lane, the village lay still around them, calm on the surface. But under the tidy lawns and clipped hedges, secrets stirred, and the whispering idol, if it existed at all, might not be just a story, especially if men were willing to kill for it. Chapter 4. The Idol and the Ink Detective Inspector. Francis Hyde was not the sort of man easily impressed. He'd cut his teeth on grim London murders, fraud rings with fingers deep in Parliament, and the occasional jewel thief who thought himself too clever by half. But even he had to admit there was something different about St. Mary Mead, not just the charm of it, the roses and hedgerows and tea served in bone china, but the precision, the quiet, watchful quality of the people. And at the centre of it all, like the needle in a compass, sat Miss Jane Marple. On his second day in the village, Hyde found himself in her drawing-room once more, notebook in hand, listening to her, speak not like an informant or a suspect, but like a fellow investigator. "Tell me again," he said, "what you know about this idol." Miss Marple poured the tea carefully. "Only what Ruth has told me. It was apparently taken from a dig site in the High Atlas region, not acquired legally. Charles Blackthorne brought it back to Marrakesh and kept it hidden. Rumour had it the piece whispered in the dark, hence the name." Hyde raised an eyebrow. "You believe in cursed relics." "I believe," Miss Marple said, handing him a scone, "that men are capable of far worse than any curse." "Fair enough. And the man, Rashid, you're certain he's here?" "I saw him myself, last night slipping through the back garden of number 4, and the red glove he left behind matches a Marrakesh receipt. I suspect he's been staying somewhere local, perhaps under a false name." Hyde jotted notes, then glanced out the lace-draped window toward Wisteria Lane. "We'll begin there. Quietly. If he's watching, we don't want to spook him." "Agreed. Though I'd suggest speaking to Judith Eastbrook as well. She has a habit of seeing what others miss." Judith was eager to help, of course. She met Inspector Hyde on the vicarage steps that afternoon, her eyes bright with excitement and nerves. "There's something you ought to know," she told him quickly, "about the charm Ruth found on her pillow." Hyde tilted his head. "Go on." I saw one like it once at the Historical Society. It came with a shipment of artefacts we were cataloguing, mostly reproductions for an exhibition. But this one, it was brass, etched with a symbol like an eye. I took a rubbing of it. She handed him a scrap of parchment. On it, the design was clearly pressed, a serpent curling around a slit-shaped eye, its tongue forked and twisted. Hyde frowned. And where is the original? Gone. It vanished from the collection 3 days ago. 3 days? Hyde said. That's after Adeline disappeared. Judith nodded. Exactly. Someone's still looking for it, or maybe replacing it. Meanwhile, Miss Marple took a different route. She paid a visit to the local library, not for books, but for people. There she found Mrs. Cartwright, the librarian, a woman with a notoriously curious nature and a fondness for foreign mysteries. Wonder, Miss Marple said after a few pleasantries, if you've noticed anyone asking after materials on Moroccan history or archaeology lately. Mrs. Cartwright pushed up her spectacles. Funny you ask. There was a man here just 2 days ago. Very polite, smelled like cloves and smoke. Asked for anything we had on ancient North African rituals. Miss Marple kept her face neutral. Did he leave a name? No, but he signed the guest book. Together they flipped to the most recent page. There, written in firm, slanted handwriting, was the name, R.A. Idrissi. Miss Marple tapped the page. And did Mr. Idrissi take anything with him? Mrs. Cartwright hesitated. Only a pamphlet, something from the 1890s on tribal funerary idols. We only had the one copy. Later that evening, Miss Marple and Inspector Hyde reconvened over toast and tea in her sitting room. He studied the name she'd copied from the guest book. Idrissi could be a pseudonym. Rashid Idrissi is a known smuggler, wanted in at least 3 countries, but I've never seen him myself. He has a limp, Miss Marple offered, and smokes those horrid little black cigarettes. Hyde nodded. That helps. I'll send word to London, see if he's surfaced elsewhere. Miss Marple looked over her own notes. He believes Adeline hid the idol, but if she destroyed it, he may have turned his attention to Ruth. Or worse, he suspects it's still in the house, in which case, Hyde said, he'll come back. They both fell silent for a moment. Then Miss Marple stood. I believe it's time we searched number 4. They entered the house just before dawn, when the village was still, sleeping. Ruth let them in, pale and shivering in her dressing gown. I haven't slept, she murmured. I keep hearing footsteps outside the window. Miss Marple took her hand. You'll be safe now, dear. Inspector Hyde searched the study while Miss Marple went upstairs. She moved slowly, methodically, letting her hands trail across bookshelves, curtains, chairbacks. She entered Adeline's room last. The window was still open, the room undisturbed since her disappearance. But on the dresser, something new caught Miss Marple's eye. A book with the spine torn off. Inside, a hollow had been cut neatly into the pages. It was empty. She called Hyde up. He inspected the book, lips tight. If something was hidden here, it's gone now, and I doubt Ruth took it. They continued to search, under floorboards, behind picture frames, inside old vases. Nothing. Until, in the attic, Hyde spotted something wedged into the rafters, a velvet pouch. Inside it was a folded scrap of paper with an address, 51 Maid Vale, London, and, more curiously, an inked drawing of the idol, serpent and eye, just like Judith's rubbing. Hyde tapped the address. Whoever this belongs to, I think they've got answers. They didn't go to London immediately. Instead, they set a trap. That evening, Hyde and 2 plainclothes constables took up quiet positions around number 4. Ruth was relocated to the vicarage under Miss Marple's care. The house was left apparently empty. At midnight, the trap was sprung. The man who entered the garden was tall, limping and silent. He moved like a shadow, a small torch in one hand. He crept towards the back window, slipped a key from his pocket, and found himself staring into the barrel of Hyde's pistol. "Rashid Idrissi," Hyde said calmly, "you're under arrest." Rashid didn't run. He simply smiled, wolfish and cold. "You don't understand," he said softly. "The idol is not destroyed, and she lied to all of you. He was taken into custody without a fight, but his words stayed behind like smoke." In the morning, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Hyde in the garden behind number 4. "She lied to us," Hyde said, "about destroying it. That's what he meant, wasn't it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I think the idol is very much alive, Francis, and perhaps not just in myth." Hyde tapped the London address again. "Time to find out who else is involved." Miss Marple stood, brushing off her skirt. Her expression was unreadable. "If we're to find the truth," she said, "we'll have to follow Adeline's path, all the way back to the beginning." Chapter 5. Echoes in Maida Vale. London greeted Miss Marple with a fog that curled like smoke around the lampposts, softening the sharp lines of the city into ghosts and suggestions. She hadn't visited in over a year, and though the buildings were familiar, the mood had shifted, more guarded somehow. Or perhaps it was she who had changed. Inspector Hyde met her at Paddington Station with a thermos of tea and a waiting car. He looked sharper than usual, coat buttoned to the throat and eyes scanning every figure that moved in the periphery. "No signs of Rashid's associates so far," he said as they pulled into traffic. "But I wouldn't wager we've seen the last of them." Rashid spoke as though others were involved. Miss Marple murmured. "She lied to all of you," he said. "That implies more than one target, more than one threat." Hyde nodded grimly. "And whatever Adeline brought back from Marrakesh, if it wasn't destroyed, it's likely in circulation, or in hiding." "Either way," said Miss Marple, "it's worth asking who would want it badly enough to kill for it." The house at 51 Maida Vale was an elegant Georgian townhouse, with a blue plaque on the wall indicating it had once belonged to a minor poet and opium addict. Its current inhabitant, however, was far more interesting. Hyde rang the bell, and a moment later the door was answered by a woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair swept back in a severe knot. Her features were hawkish, eyes too sharp for comfort. She wore a robe that looked as though it belonged in a museum, scarlet silk embroidered with ancient glyphs. "Iris Mordain," she announced without being asked, "and you are here for Adeline." Miss Marple gave a little start, but Hyde simply raised an eyebrow. "You knew she was missing?" "I know she's gone," Iris said, stepping aside, "and I know why. Come in." The sitting room was more like a museum than a home. Glass cases lined the walls, each containing strange artifacts. Carved figurines, cracked urns, a shrunken head under a bell jar. Incense burned in a stone bowl, sweet and cloying. Iris gestured for them to sit. Adeline sent word a week before she vanished. Said someone was after her, wanted something she refused to give. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The whispering idol. Iris's expression didn't change. So, you have heard of it? We've heard quite a bit, Miss Mordain, but not enough. Iris rose and crossed to one of the glass cabinets. She unlocked it with a silver key, reached inside, and withdrew a notebook wrapped in cloth. Adeline's. She asked me to keep away. It's safe. Said if anything happened to her, someone would come. She handed it to Miss Marple. The cover was leather, worn soft, the pages filled with Adeline's unmistakable scrawl, notes in both English and French, along with a series of diagrams and strange symbols. Miss Marple flipped through it carefully. The final entry chilled her. I see them in my dreams now, eyes like embers. They speak without words. The idol watches. I should never have taken it. She believed it was cursed, Miss Marple said softly. She was right, Iris replied. They always are in the end. As they drove away, Hyde read through the diary aloud. Charles bought the idol of a digger who smuggled it out of a tomb in the desert. Said it whispered at night. Adeline didn't believe it until people started dying. The digger, then one of Charles's partners, then Charles himself. Convenient accidents, Miss Marple said. She believed the idol was at the centre of it, that it drove men mad, that even if she destroyed it, the memory of it lingered. She called it a spiritual contagion. Hyde snapped the book shut. That's one word for it. Back in St. Mary Mead the following afternoon, they found the village no longer quite so still. Word had travelled, as it always did, that Miss Marple had gone to London, and returned with something in her handbag besides embroidery. Judith met them at the train station. There's something wrong with Ruth, she whispered urgently. She's frightened. Not like before. This is worse. She won't come out of her room. Keeps the curtains shut. She says Adeline has been back. Hyde stiffened. What? She heard someone in the kitchen last night. A humming sound. The same tune Mrs. Blackthorne used to hum when she made her tea. Miss Marple looked grim. Ruth's not lying. She may be on edge, but she has no reason to invent ghosts. No, Hyde said, but someone else might. They went straight to number 4. Inside, the air felt heavier than before. Not dusty or stale, charged somehow, like a storm was building within the walls. Ruth stood by the window, trembling. She was here, she insisted. I heard her, and there was something else, something left behind. She held out her hand. In it was a single earring, gold, shaped like a coiled serpent. Adeline always wore these, Ruth said, but she hadn't worn them in weeks. I know because I cleaned the dressing table myself, and now one of them just appears. Hyde took it gently. No sign of forced entry. None. Miss Marple turned to Ruth. You said she used to hum. What song? Sur le pont d'Avignon. Over and over Miss Marple's brow furrowed. That's a child's tune. Yes, Ruth said, but she never sang the words, only hummed, like a lullaby. Only wrong. That night, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the diary open on her lap, the serpent earring placed carefully beside her tea. Rain tapped the window pane like fingernails. She stared at a drawing in the diary. The idol, again and again. The same eye, the same serpent. And in the margins, Adeline had written something in Latin. Qui videt oculum, audit vocem. He who sees, the eye hears the voice. Miss Marple spoke the words aloud. The lamp flickered. She closed the book at once, heart thudding. This was no ordinary trinket Adeline had stolen. Whether one believed in curses or not, the fact remained. Wherever the idol went, madness followed. And the earring, it hadn't simply appeared. Someone was inside the house. The next morning brought new clarity and new questions. Hyde returned from the station with news. Rashid's already escaped, he said tightly. Slipped away during a transport change, en route to London. No one saw how. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. I doubt he'll go far. He still thinks the idol is here. That someone, Ruth or myself, knows where it is. Hyde laid the earring on the table. What if this is a message? Miss Marple nodded. Or a warning? They sat in silence a long while. Finally, she said, we must finish the diary. There's more to be found in those pages. Adeline hid something, and I think it's still inside number 4. Chapter 6. Beneath the Floorboards. The storm arrived just after midnight. It came sudden and vicious, as though summoned by the weight of the secrets tangled in the rafters of number 4 Wisteria Lane. Wind howled between chimneys. Rain thudded down like drumbeats against the window panes. In her bedroom above the vicarage, Ruth Blackthorne lay wide awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, clutching the serpent earring in her hand like a talisman. Across the village, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her shawl draped over her shoulders, Adeline's diary on her lap. She had read it now twice from cover to cover, and still something eluded her. A passage near the end nagged at her thoughts. The voice grows stronger at night. I hear it behind the walls. Not a voice like ours. It has weight, like stone being dragged across stone. I fear the floor beneath the study. She closed the book slowly. The study. It had been Hyde's idea to search the room again at dawn. But Miss Marple no longer believed dawn would wait. Something had shifted, subtly, but certainly. She reached for her boots. By the time she arrived at number 4, Hyde was already there. He stood by the front door, lantern in one hand, coat damp from the rain. Couldn't sleep, he said, nor I. They entered together, the house welcoming them with its usual hush. Except now the hush felt listening somehow. I've read through the diary, she told him, and I believe Adeline found something in the floor beneath the study. She may have hidden it there. Or destroyed it. Miss Marple shook her head. No, I think she tried to destroy it. But the idol doesn't burn. That's why Rashid is still searching. They crossed to the study. Hyde set down the lantern and rolled back the rug. The floorboards beneath were stained with age, some warped slightly at the edges. He ran his hand along the grain. Here, he said, this one's loose. With care, he pried it up. Beneath it, another board, thinner, splintered near the edges, barely nailed down. Together they removed it to reveal a hollow space. Inside, wrapped in a piece of burlap and sealed with wax, was a wooden box the size of a loaf of bread. Hyde drew in a breath. Could be anything. Miss Marple crouched beside him and peeled away the wrapping. The box was carved in dark wood, marked with ancient symbols, coiling serpents, staring eyes, the same as in the diary. It emanated a strange heaviness, as though it were not entirely inert. Hyde glanced at her. "We open it together." She nodded. He broke the wax seal. The lid creaked open. Inside lay the idol. Even in the dim lantern light, it seemed to shimmer. It was smaller than she expected, perhaps 6 inches tall, made of bronze or something like it, tarnished and ancient. The face was blank, the eye wide and hollow. A serpent curled around the figure's base like a tether. Miss Marple felt it before she heard it. A faint hum, low and constant, vibrating in her chest. She stared. "It's not just a relic," she said softly. "It's designed to affect the mind. Perhaps it's the metal, or some clever mechanism, a trick of resonance. Or," said Hyde, "something worse." He replaced the lid and sealed the box shut. "I'm taking this straight to Scotland Yard," he said. "We'll have their specialists examine it." Miss Marple didn't protest, but her gaze lingered on the floorboards as they restored them. The air in the room felt lighter once the box was gone, but not entirely safe. "Someone else already knew it was there," she said. "Someone who left the earring behind as a signal." Hyde narrowed his eyes. A warning? Or a promise? That morning, as the village woke slowly beneath a sky scrubbed clean by rain, Judith Eastbrook arrived at the vicarage, breathless and pale. "Ruth's gone," she said. Miss Marple froze. "She left a note," Judith went on. "Said she needed to go back to settle it." Within moments, Miss Marple was on her feet. "She's gone back to number 4. They found the house unlocked. Inside, the scent of cold ashes lingered, as though someone had attempted to burn something and failed." Ruth stood in the middle of the study, arms wrapped around herself, eyes wide and dazed. "I remembered," she whispered. "I remembered what she said." Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. "What did she say, dear?" "That it wasn't enough to hide it. That someone else already knew. That even she didn't know what it really did." Miss Marple took her gently by the arm. "The idol is gone, Ruth. It's safe now. Inspector Hyde has it." But Ruth only shook her head. "It's not the idol. It's what it calls." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Hyde. "You've been hearing things again, haven't you?" Ruth nodded, trembling. "And seeing shadows in the corners, faces in the glass." "It's fear," Miss Marple said. "Grief, guilt, perfectly natural." "No," Ruth whispered. "It's her. It's Adeline." That night, Miss Marple reviewed everything. The diary, the stolen earring, the idol, the whispering, the disappearances. And then she saw it. Something she had missed before. In the margins of one of the final pages, a small drawing. A map, not of Morocco, of Wisteria Lane. Each house marked in careful ink. But number 4 had an extra symbol next to it. A circle with a line through it. Miss Marple tapped it. She stood and reached for her coat. Judith answered the door in her nightdress, surprised, but not unwelcoming. "Jane, is everything all right?" Miss Marple showed her the map. "You helped with the Wisteria Lane Historical Register, didn't you?" "Yes, years ago. Do you recall what stood where number 4 is now?" Judith blinked. Well, before the current house, there was a rectory, burned down in 1887. Strange fire, never explained. They built the new homes a decade later. And before that, Judith thought for a moment, a chapel, deconsecrated. Some said it was used by a group of mystics, or occultists. No one quite knows. Miss Marple exhaled. It's not just the idol, she said. It's the land beneath the house. That's what she feared. She returned home just before midnight. The fire had gone out, but she didn't relight it. She sat in silence. Adeline hadn't gone mad. She'd discovered something real, something buried not just beneath floorboards, but beneath generations. The idol had called to someone. Not Rashid, not Ruth. Someone in the village. Someone who had already been watching, and tomorrow Miss Marple intended to find out exactly who. Chapter 7. The Watcher in the Wall. The following morning, Wisteria Lane basked in an unnatural calm. Children played in the lane, unaware that their mothers whispered of strange noises, flickering lights, and the old woman with sharp eyes asking too many questions. But Miss Marple had grown used to whispers. They often told her more than the words themselves. She began her morning at the parish archive, where Judith had arranged access to the dusty records of the lane's history. The small stone room behind the church smelled of mildew and beeswax. A single oil heater ticked in the corner. "I thought you might start with these," Judith said, sliding a thick ledger across the table. "Registers from 1880 to 1910. It's mostly land deeds and church documents. Boring stuff." Miss Marple offered a smile. "In my experience, Judith, it's the boring stuff that contains all the best secrets." By mid-morning, she had her first lead. The chapel that once stood where number 4 now stood had been purchased in 1878 by a man named Silas Creer, a former theologian turned mystic. His name appeared frequently in the margins, always in reference to strange symbols drawn in red ink, never part of the official text. He held private ceremonies, and by 1885 several complaints had been lodged about nocturnal chanting and processions with torches. Miss Marple turned another page. Silas Creer vanished in 1887, the same year the rectory burned down. No trace was ever found. The fire had gutted the building entirely, leaving only the stone foundation. The area was considered spiritually unsettled and left untouched until the street was redeveloped in 1896. She copied the most relevant passages into her notebook and returned home with a growing sense of dread. These were not simply village legends. There was a pattern. Each occupant of number 4 over the years had either moved suddenly, fallen ill, or died in mysterious ways. There were records of a family in the 1920s, both parents dead of carbon monoxide poisoning, while their daughter was found outside unharmed, humming to herself. In 1943, a widow hung herself in the attic. In 1952, a lodger disappeared entirely. And now Ruth Blackthorne. That evening, Miss Marple returned to number 4 alone. She had sent Ruth to stay with her cousin in Bath for the week. For rest, she had said. But it was more than that. Ruth had begun muttering in her sleep, drawing spirals on the walls in charcoal. Miss Marple unlocked the front door and stepped into the dark. The air inside had changed again, heavier, charged like the moments before a lightning strike. She did not light a lamp. Instead, She moved by memory to the study, then to the cellar door. The cellar had always been dry, its stone walls cold and plain. But now there was a hum. She stepped slowly down the stairs, her footsteps muffled by a strange pressure in the air. And at the far end of the room, behind a stack of rotting firewood, she found a door, or what had once been a door, now sealed with bricks. She stared, heart slowing. The bricks were old but newer than the foundation. They had been laid deliberately, a barrier. In the faint light from her torch, she saw something carved into one brick, a single eye, the same as in Adeline's drawings. And above it, faint and almost lost to time, words etched into stone. In darkness it sleeps, in voice it wakes. The next morning, Inspector Hyde arrived from London looking gaunt and frustrated. "The idol's gone," he said flatly. "It was stolen from the yard overnight. No signs of forced entry. No security footage. Nothing." Miss Marple didn't blink. "Then it never left Wisteria Lane." Hyde stared. "You think it was a decoy?" "I think it was returned." She told him everything. Silas Creer, the burned chapel, the sealed cellar door, the whispering that had begun anew, and Ruth's final drawings before she left. "They weren't random," she said. "They were a map." Hyde followed her to the cellar, where she revealed the bricked-over doorway. "We need to know what's behind this wall," she said. Hyde stared at the carving of the eye. "I'm not sure we want to know." But an hour later, with the help of 2 constables and a mason called in from the village, they carefully removed the bricks. Behind them lay a narrow stone corridor, sloping downward, far older than the house. Above it, the air was damp, metallic, laced with rot and something else, incense. The corridor ended in a small circular chamber, and in the centre stood a plinth. Empty. Hyde turned to her. "It was kept here," Miss Marple nodded, "until Adeline found it." Around the plinth were signs of recent use: wax drippings, torn fabric, traces of charcoal. A crude circle had been drawn around the base, and on the far wall, scratched in Shianshu, the stone in a frantic hand. It still speaks. They sealed the chamber and left quietly, placing officers outside number 4 under cover of darkness. Miss Marple returned home, exhausted, but her sleep did not last. At 3:12 a.m., a sharp knock came at the vicarage door. It was Constable Harris, breathless. "There's been another break-in," he said. "At number 7, Judith Eastbrook's house." Miss Marple was on her feet in an instant. Judith stood at the threshold in her robe, hands trembling. "They didn't take anything," she whispered. "They left something." In her open palm was a small stone, polished, black as coal, shaped like an eye. Miss Marple stared. "Where did you find it?" "In my bed." Later that night, after Judith had been moved to the inn for her safety and the house had been searched, Hyde stood with Miss Marple at the edge of the lane. "They're toying with us now," he said, "whoever they are." "They're not far," Miss Marple replied. "In fact, I believe they've been watching us all along." She turned slowly and looked at the row of houses opposite number 4. "There's one house," she said, "that has remained untouched. Quiet, helpful, even." Hyde followed her gaze. "The vicarage?" "No," she said. "Number 9. Chapter 8. Number 9. a house. Too perfect, there was always something suspicious about perfection. Number 9. Wisteria Lane stood with a kind of self-conscious order. Hedges trimmed precisely, curtains always drawn at the same level, porch swept, even when it hadn't rained in weeks. Miss Marple had walked past it dozens of times and never once seen a visitor enter or exit. But it wasn't just the stillness of the place that caught her attention now. It was that in all the talk of whisperings, strange lights and missing objects, no one had ever mentioned number 9. Not once, not even in gossip. And that silence, Miss Marple believed, was intentional. The resident Miss Griselda Martin had lived at number 9 for over 30 years. A former schoolmistress from Bournemouth, she was known to the village as courteous, fiercely private and, by all accounts, utterly unremarkable. She volunteers at the library, Judith had once said. But she never really talks, you know. Just sort of observes. It was this precise quality that now placed her under Miss Marple's careful scrutiny. And so, late one morning, under the pretence of returning a borrowed gardening book, Miss Marple arrived at number 9's polished doorstep and rang the bell. The door opened immediately. Miss Martin, tall, stooped, with hawk-like features and a wool cardigan the colour of ash, stood there with a polite smile. "Miss Marple," she said. "How unusual! Do come in!" Inside the watchtower. The interior of number 9 was as meticulous as the exterior. Every surface gleamed, every book aligned, every photograph framed at a precise angle. There was no scent of dust, no music, no warmth. Miss Martin offered tea, which Miss Marple declined. "I was just revisiting some old notes," Miss Martin said, gesturing to a desk beside the window. A large ledger lay open, filled with tidy handwriting. "Village census?" Miss Marple asked. "I keep a record," said Miss Martin, smiling faintly. "Out of habit. It helps me keep track." Miss Marple stepped closer. The ledger wasn't merely names and addresses. It detailed movements, visitors, arrival and departure, times, even post-delivery schedules. "You've taken great care," Miss Marple said mildly. Miss Martin tilted her head. "It pays to observe, Miss Marple. You, of all people, understand that." There was no challenge in her tone, only quiet knowledge. Miss Marple met her gaze evenly. "Then perhaps you've observed the oddities at number 4. "I've observed everything," said Miss Martin. A frightening confession. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. "I know about the idol," she said. Miss Marple's breath caught. "I've seen it, before you or the inspector ever arrived. It was brought into the house weeks ago. Or rather, returned. But it's never truly gone, you see. It's bound to the lane, like a thread through a needle." "Bound how?" Miss Martin's eyes gleamed. "By belief, by memory. It feeds on them." Miss Marple sat down slowly. "How long have you known?" "I suspected when Adeline first moved in. She was sensitive. She heard it early. Then Ruth. They called it madness, but it's not. It's awareness." "Awareness of what?" Miss Martin rose. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked to a cabinet and removed a small parcel. She placed it in Miss Marple's lap. Inside was a bundle of letters, yellowed, brittle, and bound with twine. "They're from Silas Creer," she said. "My grandfather. The bloodline. The truth struck like a thunderclap. Miss Martin, prim, distant, forgettable, was the last remaining descendant of the occultist who had built the original chapel on the land now occupied by number 4. "Your name isn't Martin," Miss Marple said. "No," she admitted. "It's Creer. I changed it after the war. I didn't want questions. I never practiced his rituals, but I studied them, learned the truth." Miss Marple read one of the letters dated 1886. It spoke of the eye, of opening the mind's gate, of sacrifice. "I don't want power," Miss Martin said. "I want balance. The idol, if left alone, is dormant. But it cannot be moved or studied or desecrated. That's when the voice begins." "You've been keeping it dormant?" Miss Marple asked. "For decades. Watching, waiting, guiding its return when others disturbed it. That's why I had to intervene." "You stole it from the yard?" Miss Martin gave a small nod. "To bring it back here, to seal it again, a reckoning at the plinth." That night, under cover of thick fog, Miss Marple and Hyde returned with Miss Martin to number 4. They descended into the hidden chamber together. Miss Martin carried the idol, now wrapped in dark cloth, close to her chest. They stood in silence around the plinth. "I will stay here," she said, "to ensure it doesn't call again." "You can't remain in that house," Hyde said. "It's not safe." "It's not meant to be safe," she replied. "It's meant to be guarded." She placed the idol down gently. The chamber pulsed, with sudden stillness, as if the very air held its breath. Miss Marple lit a single candle and placed it beside the plinth. Its flame stood straight, unmoving. The whispering ceased, and in that silence Miss Marple finally understood. The horror hadn't been created by Silas Creer. It had been found. And now, at last, it was where it belonged. Farewell to the shadows, too. Days later, Miss Martin packed her things and left number 9 without a word. She didn't stay in the village. Some said she went to France. Others claimed she entered a convent. Miss Marple knew the truth. She had gone to find another place, another thread of the needle to watch again. Chapter 9. The Voice That Lingers. The Calm That Wasn't. A week passed, and Wisteria Lane seemed to exhale. The whispers had stopped. The air felt lighter. Number 4 stood silent once again, and even the children dared to walk past it without holding their breath. But Miss Marple was not content. "It's too tidy," she murmured one morning to Judith as they took tea beneath the honeysuckle arbour. "Too resolved, as if the pieces were arranged a little too neatly." "You don't think it's over?" Judith asked, pouring more tea. "Miss Martin may have believed she'd sealed the threat," said Miss Marple, "but threats of this kind don't seal. They linger." She wasn't wrong. That night, Ruth Blackthorne returned from her stay in Bath. Miss Marple had sent word it was safe again, and Ruth, though still pale and tired, had written back with cautious optimism. But within hours of returning to number 4, Ruth called the vicarage in tears. "The voice is back," she said, "but it's different now. It says a name." Miss Marple gently asked what the name was, and Ruth, barely above a whisper, replied, "Adeline." The next morning, Miss Marple visited the grave of Adeline Blackthorne. It was a simple headstone, worn by wind and time, with a small ceramic angel affixed to the base. There had always been something incomplete about the girl's death. Too sudden, too still. She had been bright, curious, artistic. Miss Marple remembered her as a girl who never played by the village's rules, and who carried secrets in her eyes. She placed a sprig of lavender on the grave, and as she turned to leave, she noticed something unusual. A white envelope tucked between the flowers, slightly damp with dew. It was addressed simply, "To whoever listens." Inside was a single sheet, written in Adeline's handwriting. "I hear it too, but I'm not afraid of it. It watches because it's lonely. It speaks because it remembers. It never hurt me, but it wants me to know its name. And once I do, I think it'll leave me alone. I think it just wants to be seen. If I disappear, tell Ruth not to follow me. She's too soft. She'll break. And tell Miss Marple, thank you. She always looked even when no one else did." Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her coat. Miss Marple returned home and spread everything she had across her study table. Silas Creer's letters, the chapel's history, Adeline's drawings, Ruth's sketches, Judith's records of noises and lights, and now this final note. What stood out to her, beyond the occult symbols and carved eyes and eerie whispers, was something simpler. The desire to be understood, and suddenly a memory surfaced. Years ago, during a brief holiday in Norfolk, Miss Marple had encountered a family plagued by similar phenomena. Lights, voices, shifting shadows. It had been explained away as a haunting, but in truth it had been a child, a hidden child, raised in isolation beneath the house, taught to fear the world and mimic ghost stories to keep it at bay. Could something similar have happened here? Not a ghost, not a curse, a presence, a person, hidden beneath the layers of myth. Miss Marple returned to number 4, the echo chamber. She walked the cellar once more, now stripped of the idol and the strangeness. And yet, when she reached the bricked wall, she felt it again, a breath not her own. She lit a match and held it to the wall. The flame bent ever so slightly. A breeze, a draught. Not all the walls were solid. She retrieved Hyde, and with careful precision they examined the stonework. Behind a panel near the back, beneath what had once been the old chapel altar, they found a hidden stair. It led to a second, narrower chamber, and inside was a bed, a table, stale food, a book of poems, and walls painted with spirals and symbols, but most haunting of all, a sketch of Adeline. Smiling, the boy beneath. They found him the next day, wandering the woods just beyond the village edge. He was no ghost, no phantom, no spirit from the beyond. He was a man, perhaps in his 30s, though his thin frame and shrunken posture made him seem younger. He had lived beneath number 4 his entire life, left behind by Silas Creer's followers after the collapse of their cult, raised in the dark by one of the last disciples who died when he was a child. His name, he said, was Nathaniel, and he was the one who whispered. "I didn't mean to frighten them," he said softly. "Adeline, she was kind. She talked to me, brought me books. She knew I was there. She left a note," Miss Marple said gently. "She knew you meant no harm. She told me to be patient, that one day someone would come." Miss Marple took his hand. They have. A village reckoning. The village did not take the news easily. Some refused to believe it. Others insisted the boy was a ghost in disguise. But over time, as truth replaced legend, fear gave way to pity. Nathaniel was placed in care with a family in nearby Little Davington. He was taught to read properly, to write, to walk freely in the sunlight without fear. Ruth Blackthorne sold number 4 and moved away. She left a painting behind, a portrait of Adeline, and a spiral of silver ink behind her, one hand extended as if offering peace. And Miss Marple, for her part, kept only the letter. The voice remembered. On her final visit to the sealed chamber, beneath number 4, now bricked permanently and blessed by the church, Miss Marple stood in silence for several minutes. Then she whispered, "You've been seen." And in the quiet that followed, she could have sworn she heard a sigh. Not a malevolent sound, but the sound of something finally letting go. Chapter 10. The Whisper. That fades by midsummer, Wisteria Lane had transformed. Children once again chased hoops across the cobbles, roses climbed cheerfully up trellises, and even the birds, silent during the dark weeks, sang again in the hedgerows. Number 4 had been emptied, cleaned, and repainted. No new tenants had yet moved in. But for the first time in months, no one crossed to the other side of the lane when passing it. The fear had lifted. But Miss Marple, ever cautious, knew that not all shadows vanish with the sunrise. Some retreat, some wait, and some are simply transformed. Nathaniel Creer, no longer a whisper in the dark, but a soft-spoken man with grey-blue eyes and a growing love for poetry, had settled into his new life. He now resided in a small cottage in Little Davington, under the guardianship of the local schoolmistress and her husband, a retired bookseller. Miss Marple visited him one last time before the case was fully closed. "Do you remember," she asked, "the first time you saw Adeline?" He nodded. "She sat in the garden, reading. I watched from the vent. She was reading Keats." "Did she know?" "She looked right at me one day. Didn't speak, just smiled. After that, she began leaving. Books, marked with chalk so I'd know they were for me. And you whispered to her. I was afraid," he said. "But she was never afraid of me. She said I reminded her of a ghost in one of her stories, lonely but not evil. She told me it's possible to be both frightened and gentle, Tessu." Marple looked at the garden outside his window. Sunlight soft across the grass. Children laughing in the distance. "She was right," she said. "Ruth Blackthorne sold number 4 to a young couple from Oxford. She left behind all of Adeline's artwork, carefully stored and labelled in a wooden chest." Before leaving the village, Ruth visited Miss Marple with a small envelope. Inside was a final watercolour, Adeline in profile, a single spiral glowing. Behind her, and in her hand, a book titled The Light in the Hollow. She painted it before she... Ruth faltered. "Before she changed." "She never changed," Miss Marple said gently. "She simply saw the world more clearly than most, left quietly, never to return." The young couple who bought the house planted lavender along the front gate. They said it smelled of calm and clarity. They never heard whispers. Judith Denby remained Miss Marple's closest companion through the entire affair. She had been brave, inquisitive, and, at times, terrified. But as the village settled, so, too, did her nerves. "Do you think," she asked one evening, "that we'll ever understand all of it? I mean truly?" Miss Marple smiled. "I think we understood enough. The rest, well, some mysteries are meant to linger, not to be solved." Judith nodded. "And the idol?" "Returned, buried, sealed, forgotten, hopefully for good. But it wasn't evil, was it?" Miss Marple paused. "It was a vessel, a symbol, like a mirror. It only showed what we were willing to see. Fear can twist anything into evil, but in the right hands, even something dark can serve as a warning." She glanced down at the letter Adeline had left, still pressed between the pages of Pride and Prejudice on her nightstand. "Sometimes," she said, "we must listen to the whispers, because they come from the quiet parts of us we've long ignored." At the next village fete, Reverend Toller delivered a sermon not on sin or salvation, but on compassion. He spoke of listening to the unheard, of watching for those unseen, and of remembering the stories buried beneath our feet. He never named Nathaniel, but those who had lived through the whispers understood. They applauded quietly, with heads bowed, not in fear, but in gratitude. Months passed. Autumn arrived crisp and golden. Leaves turned and fell, and the village resumed its comforting routine. But some evenings, just as the mist rolled in and the air turned cool, Miss Marple would walk past number 4 and pause at the gate. Not out of dread, but reverence, she would tilt her head, listening, not for a voice, but for its absence. And each time, when nothing came, she would smile. Miss Marple reflects, in the solitude of her parlour one winter morning, Miss Marple reread a letter she had written to her nephew, Raymond West. "My dear Raymond, you would be delighted to know that the dreadful affair on Wisteria Lane has at last resolved. Though it had its roots in the most dramatic of ideas, cultish relics, sealed chambers and whispered hauntings, it proved to be in the end a tragedy of human loneliness more than anything else. A young man locked beneath the floorboards of the world, a young woman with eyes sharp enough to see him, and a village too proud or too fearful to peer beneath the surface. It sounds like something from one of your mystery novels, but you'll find it in no library catalogue, only in hearts, only in memory. Affectionately, your Aunt Jane." She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it on her writing desk. Later, she would walk to the post office and send it, but for now, she simply sat in the silence. Not an empty silence, a full one. The last whisper was not in the cellar, nor in the garden, nor even in the chapel's shadow. It was in the wind, a year later, as the cherry trees bloomed and laughter once again filled the lane. A small child, newly moved into number 4, stopped while playing and looked over her shoulder. "I heard a story," she told her mother. In the wall, her mother laughed. "About what?" The girl smiled. "A lonely boy who found a friend." And then she returned to her skipping, and the wind carried her whisper away.